It's incredible. Our drones have turned the war upside down. Crimea is burning. The armed forces have made it a living hell for the occupiers. Shocking. Putin was being fooled right in the Kremlin. The dictator is being isolated by his own. Will the bunker dweller finally be dethroned? China is taking everything. While Putin fights, Xi Jinping is reshaping the entire region for himself. Russian influence is melting away, and Moscow is falling deeper into dependence on Beijing. Great Russia is bursting at the seams. We'll talk about this right now. Greetings! This is Ukraine Today. I'm Maria Farafonova with the latest events. Once again, the fire of revenge burns in Crimea due to the work of Ukrainian drones. Two strategic electrical substations, Yanikapu and Titan, which provide power to the northern part of the occupied peninsula, were hit by a powerful strike. And while the occupation authorities traditionally try not to dramatize, NASA satellites recorded abnormally high temperatures at these sites, typical of large-scale fires. The attack on the Yanikapu substation, one of the main energy hubs of northern Crimea, was particularly significant. It is through this station that Armyansk, Yanikapu, and a number of important industrial facilities receive power. According to monitoring data, a fire broke out there around 4 in the morning, and even before that, a large-scale power outage had already been recorded in the area. It seems that for some of the occupiers, the night was not only sleepless but also quite dark. The strike on the Titan substation near Armyansk looks no less painful. This is not just another energy facility, but one of the key links in the entire Crimean power system. It ensures the operation of industrial enterprises and participates in the distribution of electricity between important areas of the peninsula. In other words, we are not talking about a random target, but about another strike on the critical infrastructure of the occupation forces. Crimea is rapidly losing its status as a safe rear for the Russian army. And what is particularly symbolic, while Ukrainian drones methodically hunt for bridges, logistics routes, warehouses, headquarters, and supply columns of the occupiers, energy infrastructure is increasingly being added to their list of targets. New strikes on key facilities on the peninsula only emphasize the trend. The Ukrainian drone revolution is gradually destroying everything that the Russian presence in Crimea relies on. And artificial intelligence, long-range drones, and constant reconnaissance are turning the unsinkable aircraft carrier once touted by Kremlin propaganda into a territory where electricity, fuel, communications, and the occupiers' confidence in their own safety can disappear every night. More on the explosive work of our drones in the report. Ukrainian drones continue to rewrite the rules of war. New Ukrainian drones are methodically destroying the foundation of the enemy army, logistics. It is they who in recent days have struck bridges in Chonhar, Henichesk, and Armyansk, through which the occupiers have for years transferred equipment, ammunition, and fuel from Crimea to the southern front. The distance to the targets range from 80 to 120 kilometers from the line of contact, but for the new Ukrainian drones, this has long ceased to be a problem. The main stars of the operation were the latest Ukrainian strike drones, Firepoint FP2 and Hippo. The first has a wingspan of over 5 meters and can carry about 100 kilograms of explosives. The second, with a wingspan of over 2 meters, is equipped with thermobaric and high-explosive charges totaling about 75 kilograms. In fact, this is a new class of cheap but highly effective weapons that allow for strikes on strategic targets without using expensive missiles. According to the occupation authorities, at least 45 drones were launched at the bridges in Armyansk alone, and about 20 more at the Chonhar crossing. Even the Gauleiter Saldo was forced to admit damage to the structures and the start of their inspection. Translated from officialese, this means the strikes were so significant that it's no longer possible to hide them. The consequences were immediate. Traffic through Chonhar had to be shut down. The occupation administration urgently began seeking detour routes, and supply disruptions have already led to fuel shortages and the suspension of civilian bus services. It seems Ukrainian drones are gradually doing what military analysts only recently spoke of, turning the logistics of the Russian group in the south into a real survival quest. And while Russian propaganda continues to talk about being in control, Ukrainian drones are methodically proving the opposite. Today, they are hunting more than just warehouses, headquarters, and oil depots. Now, entire transport arteries of the occupiers are becoming their prey. And when hundreds of tons of ammunition and fuel can't reach the front on time, even the loudest Kremlin statements start to sound much quieter. However, the strikes on the bridges at Chonhar, Henichesk, and Armyansk are just the tip of the iceberg. Behind the increasingly precise attacks by Ukrainian drones are technologies that just a few years ago seemed like science fiction. And it seems they are starting to break one of the Russian army's main advantages, a deep rear that was previously considered relatively safe. The Ministry of Defense reported that in recent months, the defense forces have quadrupled the scale of destruction of enemy equipment, depots, and supply routes at operational depth. Artificial intelligence has become the main assistant in this work. Where Russian electronic warfare systems try to jam or spoof satellite navigation, a modern Ukrainian drone effectively begins to navigate on its own. A specialized onboard computer, along with cameras, continuously scans roads, rivers, tree lines, and terrain features. The artificial intelligence instantly compares the captured image with preloaded high-resolution satellite maps. As a result, the drone determines its location not by GPS, but by what it literally sees beneath it. In such situations, Russian electronic warfare measures are increasingly left powerless. The most interesting part begins just before the strike. When the drone nears the target, the neural network takes over and begins analyzing the video in real time. If the task is to destroy an air defense system, the algorithm independently finds the launcher or radar, locks onto the target, and adjusts the trajectory for a pinpoint hit. Actually, the machine finishes the attack itself, even during heavy enemy electronic warfare. What's more, modern algorithms are already being trained to recognize decoys. While occupiers used to set up mock-ups to trick expensive munitions into hitting plywood, neural networks now analyze an object's shape, texture, positioning, and even indirect signs of engine activity. In other words, it's becoming increasingly difficult for Russian troops to hide behind decoys. Artificial intelligence plays a distinct role even before the mission begins. For strikes at distances up to 200 kilometers, the program calculates a complex route, accounting for terrain, enemy radar locations, potential blind spots, and air defense zones. As a result, the Ukrainian drone takes not the shortest path, but the one that is most dangerous for the enemy. And while the Russian rear was once considered a place to rest from the war, more and more warehouses, headquarters, oil depots, and logistics hubs are finding that distance has long since ceased to be an obstacle for Ukrainian drones. And while some Ukrainian drones methodically destroy the occupiers' bridges, warehouses, and equipment, others are busy hunting for information. After all, before delivering a precise strike on enemy logistics, it's necessary to study supply routes, resource accumulation points, and defensive weaknesses in detail. It seems this is exactly what Ukrainian drones are currently active with over temporarily occupied Crimea. A video recently surfaced online which allegedly captures a Ukrainian strike drone flying over the logistics routes of Russian troops on the peninsula. Judging by the footage, the drone was in no hurry to strike, but carefully studied the territory, scouting the areas through which the occupiers move equipment, ammunition, and fuel. In other words, the drone could be gathering the very information that later translates into destroyed bridges, burned warehouses, and blocked supply routes. There it is, look. That's the third one already. The reaction of the Russians themselves adds a particularly nervous tone to the situation. After such footage appeared, Russian sources began talking about an urgent need to bolster security on the peninsula. To protect vital sites and logistics arteries, occupation forces have begun deploying additional mobile fire groups to hunt for Ukrainian drones. It seems they're realizing in Crimea, if a Ukrainian drone circles above, it's not just for surveillance, but preparation for a future strike. The Ukrainian drone revolution continues to gain momentum. Today, these are no longer just drones with explosives, but an entire ecosystem of reconnaissance, artificial intelligence, and precision strikes that is erasing the occupier's advantage in the rear day by day. Ukrainian drones first find a target, then study it, and later return to deliver a strike. Tadis. If only yesterday the Russians were certain that distance, electronic warfare, or mock-ups could save them, today the reality looks quite different. For Ukrainian drones, there are fewer and fewer unreachable routes, untouched warehouses, or safe areas. And this means that the hunt for Russian logistics is only gaining momentum, and the most unpleasant surprises for the occupiers may still be ahead. It seems that the main victim of Russian propaganda all these years was Putin himself. Former editor-in-chief of the Vesti program, Dmitry Skorobatov, spoke about the existence of a special television project codenamed The Main Viewer. Its essence was quite simple and at the same time absurd. For the master of the Kremlin, separate news broadcasts were prepared that never went on air and were intended for only one viewer, Putin himself. In fact, for years, a parallel reality of its own existed in the Kremlin. While Russians were shown one version of events, an even more sterile information picture was created for the president, where uncomfortable topics, problems, and threats underwent additional filtering. According to Skorobatov, the system began to work actively after the protests on Bolotnaya Square in 2012, when the authorities began to fear any unpleasant information particularly acutely. But the most interesting part began after the start of the full-scale war. According to the former editor, the level of censorship around Putin became so strict that after the sinking of the cruiser Moskva in April 2022, the Russian dictator was effectively kept in an information vacuum for over a week. The irony of fate is that the ship, which was supposed to symbolize the power of the Russian fleet, disappeared faster than this information reached the commander-in-chief. If this information is true, then it becomes clear why many of the Kremlin's decisions in recent years seem detached from reality. After all, it's difficult to adequately assess the situation at the front when you've been shown a specially edited version of the world for years. And while Russian propaganda tries to convince citizens that everything is going according to plan, it looks more and more like the main hostage of this plan has become its author. The Kremlin smells of something much more dangerous than another package of sanctions. While Russian propaganda continues to talk about stability and control over the situation, signals are beginning to emerge from the Russian system itself that until recently seemed impossible. And now data is appearing that could explain why there have been more and more nervous faces in Moscow lately. Is Putin really starting to lose control of the situation? And why could the coming months be particularly unpleasant for the Kremlin? We'll find out in the report. Putin is already one step away from collapse. The smell of crisis is becoming more and more distinct in the Kremlin. And this time, it's not the opposition sounding the alarm at all. Even in the Russian State Duma, it's becoming increasingly difficult to hide the nervousness. Communist Party Deputy Vyacheslav Markayev openly accused the Kremlin of corruption and warned that Russia is approaching a powerful social explosion. According to him, the time of illusions is over, and the responsibility for possible chaos will lie entirely with the current government. For a system where officials have competed for years in loyalty to Putin, such statements sound like a rather alarming signal from within. Even more interesting is that Markayev spoke directly about the risk of mass unrest and effectively admitted that the situation in the country is becoming increasingly unstable. Another deputy communist, Rinat Suleimanov, who previously called for the war to end as soon as possible, joined the criticism. It seems that even in political circles loyal to the Kremlin, an uncomfortable question is being asked more and more often. How much longer can Russia endure this war? Reasons for dissatisfaction are piling up one after another. Massive internet outages, the lack of tangible success at the front, economic problems, and regular Ukrainian drone strikes on the Russian rear are hitting public morale harder and harder. And while propaganda continues to talk about stability, even representatives of the system itself are starting to speak openly about the dangerous social pressure building up behind the facade of Kremlin confidence. Meanwhile, Kyiv is adding fuel to the fire. Volodymyr Zelensky's publication of intelligence on the internal situation in Russia came as a total shock to Putin. The president stated that Ukrainian intelligence had obtained documents on the real internal political state of Russia, the very reports that land directly on Putin's desk. And even despite the tradition of Russian officials sugarcoating reality, the picture emerging there is quite bleak.
We understand that Putin is rarely given completely truthful information without sugarcoating. But even what he sees in the documents that reach him still allows for conclusions to be drawn.
According to intelligence, the level of Russian dissatisfaction with Putin continues to grow and shows no signs of stabilizing even on the eve of the September elections. Moreover, support for the ruling party is gradually sagging, and this creates a rather awkward dilemma for the Kremlin. Either explain to voters why everything is getting worse, or once again demonstrate the wonders of electoral mathematics. No less alarming for Moscow is the growth of protest sentiments in the regions. While Russian propaganda talks about national unity, the authorities themselves seem to be carefully calculating where and when the accumulated dissatisfaction might break through. Especially considering that summer is still ahead, with its economic problems, strikes on logistics, fuel difficulties, and Ukrainian drone attacks.
We believe that these reports do not yet take into account potential events in June, July, and August, which cannot fail to further affect the situation in Russia.
And this is where the most interesting part begins. Ukraine no longer hides its intention to continue increasing pressure on Russia, military, economic, and diplomatic. This means that for the Kremlin, the most difficult months may still be ahead. After all, when the economy weakens, social problems accumulate, ratings fall, and drones arrive all at once, even the strongest propaganda starts to malfunction.
Completely justified pressure on Russia for this war will continue and will increase. And not just our pressure. So by September, Putin will emerge with even significantly worse indicators.
This is a kind of public reminder. While Russian propaganda tries to convince the world of the regime's steadfastness, Ukraine increasingly demonstrates a completely different image of the Kremlin, one that is losing control over events and is forced to constantly extinguish new crises. The last few months for Moscow have turned into a real streak of failures. Fuel problems in a country that for decades prided itself on its status as an energy superpower, strikes on logistics, attacks on strategic targets, and constant failures in the information war. A rather sarcastic picture is emerging. The Kremlin still talks about its strength, but spends more and more time not on the offensive, but on dealing with the consequences of its own problems. Ukraine's main bet now is not just on destroying individual targets, but on maintaining a pace of strikes and challenges that Russia simply cannot adapt to in time. The longer the economic, budgetary, and social exhaustion lasts, the weaker the Kremlin's ability to respond to new strikes becomes. And when the system starts to lag behind events, every new problem automatically generates several more. That's why on the eve of the G7 summit, the NATO meeting, and a new sanctions package, Kyiv is actively promoting a simple message for Western partners. Russia no longer looks like a party that is in control of the situation. On the contrary, more and more signs indicate that the Kremlin's resources are being depleted faster than it can hide it. And as we know, people are much more willing to invest in someone who can win than in someone who tries to explain their problems with more propaganda tales. And the most unpleasant thing for Moscow is that the problem is accumulating from several sides at once. A new EU sanctions package, increased pressure on the shadow oil fleet, risks to energy revenues, and an increasingly active Ukrainian campaign of long-range strikes. If until recently the Kremlin sold the world the image of an invulnerable fortress, today this image increasingly resembles the facade of a building where cracks are visible even from afar. And it seems Ukraine's main task now is not to let these cracks heal, but to turn them into a real collapse. For years, the Kremlin considered Central Asia its backyard. But it seems that while Moscow was spending billions on the war, a new master quietly moved in. China has already officially overtaken Russia in terms of direct investment in the region, over $35 billion versus Moscow's approximately $20 billion. And most ironically, Putin himself admitted this, calling Russian investments quite modest. For a state that for decades talked about its special influence in the post-Soviet space, this sounds like a rather painful humiliation. While Russian propaganda dreams of restoring imperial influence, China is methodically buying up the most valuable assets: oil, gas, mineral deposits, transport corridors, and energy infrastructure. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan are increasingly looking not at Moscow, but at Beijing. It turns out to be quite symbolic. Russia is fighting for territories, while China, meanwhile, is taking over the economy. The situation in Uzbekistan is particularly telling. In just 5 years, Chinese investment there has grown more than fivefold. Beijing is building power plants, investing in manufacturing, and controlling more and more strategic projects. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is gradually losing even those positions that previously seemed guaranteed. If until recently Moscow tried to sell itself as a center of power for the entire region, now it increasingly resembles a junior partner who realized too late that its place at the table has already been taken. And this is where the most unpleasant part for Russia begins. Western sanctions and war spending are forcing the Kremlin to become increasingly dependent on China. But in international politics, there is no such thing as friendship. There are only interests. As Moscow weakens, Beijing secures increasingly favorable terms, new markets, and control over resources. It seems that Russia, which dreamed of becoming the center of a new anti-Western bloc, is gradually turning into a raw material appendage to the Chinese economy. And the longer the war lasts, the more expensive this friendship without limits becomes for the Kremlin. More on the toxic relationship between Beijing and Moscow in our report. China is devouring Russia. Quietly, without unnecessary words. Xi Jinping is taking territories, and Putin gladly gives them away and bows at his feet. Beijing is turning the Far East and Siberia into a raw material appendage with long-term Chinese contracts. A prime example is the Zashulanskoye coal field in Transbaikalia, developed jointly by the Russian N+ Group and the Chinese Shenhua Group. The project is designed for a century of extraction, and the Russian side is also generously handing out tax breaks. In fact, it looks like a long-term lease of the region in exchange for investment, with Beijing as the main beneficiary. Starting in 2027, they plan to ship about 5 million tons of coal to China from here annually. That's hundreds of trucks every day. New routes are being laid literally through forests, near mineral water springs, and nature conservation areas. Ecology, it seems, is a secondary detail in this system, simply not included in the business plan. Parallel to resources, China is actively entering the region through people and business. In the Baikal region, tourism infrastructure is growing to cater to Chinese visitors. Investors are buying up land and building hotels, squeezing out local entrepreneurs. According to various estimates, up to 2 million Chinese citizens may already be in the Far East. Against this backdrop, it looks less like a partnership and more like a gradual economic reshaping of the region to serve Beijing's interests. And while Russia is gradually becoming a resource periphery for China, even harsher scenarios are appearing in the Chinese information space. No longer about cooperation, but about the actual division of Russian territories in the event of a crisis. And surprisingly, this is presented not as a fantasy, but as a geopolitical calculation. An article appeared in Chinese media directly discussing potential control over 7 million square kilometers of the Russian Far East in the event of a domestic collapse of the Russian Federation. The authors point out that due to the war against Ukraine, Russian forces have been moved west, leaving eastern regions virtually empty, with minimal military presence and weak territorial control. The economic conclusion sounds even harsher. Russia, according to the authors, is rapidly degrading, and its economy is allegedly smaller than a single Chinese province. And here, cold logic sets in. If the center of the Russian Federation weakens, the Far East and its resources must not go to waste. At the same time, the authors cautiously warn Beijing against direct military expansion, hinting at a scenario of international isolation similar to the situation around Crimea. Instead, another approach is proposed, a soft takeover through investment, long-term contracts, and support for friendly forces in the region that formally maintain independence but effectively become dependent on China. In fact, the text conveys the main idea without any sugarcoating. Russia no longer seems capable of fully controlling its own eastern territories, and China, seizing the moment, can gradually fill this vacuum of influence. And even if all this is presented as analytics, the very appearance of such scenarios in the public space looks like a signal. Beijing is already thinking in terms of a post-Russia era.
The collapse of Russia is no joke. Only through careful preparation can we move forward with confidence.
And perhaps the Celestial Empire won't wait for the Russian Federation's collapse, but it will speak the language of force. China is building a giant military mega-complex in the desert, so massive that Western analysts are already saying outright they have never seen anything like it. It's about a new strategic zone near intercontinental nuclear missile silos, where, according to Reuters, over 80 launch pads, bunkers, a railway hub, airfields, and control centers are being built. Essentially a full-fledged military fortress of the future. Of particular concern are 3 giant octagonal complexes surrounded by fortifications and protected infrastructure. Experts suggest that electronic warfare systems, command centers, or elements of nuclear infrastructure, including the preparation and deployment of mobile missile systems, could be located there. But the key detail is, no one knows exactly what's inside. And it's this very uncertainty that scares analysts the most. In fact, we're talking about an unprecedented expansion of China's nuclear architecture amidst the intensifying confrontation with the United States, especially around Taiwan. In the desert, not just a military base is rising, but a new level of strategic reality, where Beijing demonstrates its readiness to play the long game. And while the world tries to grasp the scale of what's been seen, experts admit they haven't recorded such a level of military construction in the era of nuclear states before. For Putin, this is a real geopolitical cold shower. Russia increasingly looks less like an independent center of power and more like a resource periphery in China's orbit. The Celestial Empire isn't acting abruptly, for now, but it seems Putin might live to see the day when Xi Jinping takes what's his abruptly and without warning. And what do you think about the latest events? Share your opinion in the comments, give it a like, and subscribe so you don't miss the main news. See you in the next episode.